Football and rugby had become very popular by the late 19th century. Brentford had no such clubs of any note, but in 1889 the Brentford Rowing Club, founded 2 years earlier, decided they should also play a winter sport. At their meeting on the 16th of October, held at the Oxford and Cambridge Hotel, it was decided by 8 votes to 5 that a football rather than a rugby club should be formed, and so that day Brentford F.C. was created. The Oxford and Cambridge Hotel was located on the north Brentford side of the old Kew Bridge. A new, wider bridge replaced this one in 1903. The hotel that was the headquarters for the rowing club was demolished around the end of the First World War. This column on the building adjacent to the 1/8 pub is located exactly where the corner of the former Oxford and Cambridge stood. A short walk along the side the bridge leads to Kew Bridge Road. 131 years later, the Bees were destined to return to Kew, the new ground being located just behind the buildings at Kew Station. Further down the road to the Half Acre and Brentford itself. A search had to be made to decide where the club would play their matches, and it was decided that an application to make use of the recently opened recreation ground near St Paul's Church would be made, but there were objections that as the rec was installed for the local community and being very open, it would be overused. A decision would not be forthcoming for 3 weeks, and it was decided that this was too long for the club to await a decision, especially as it may well be turned down. The recreation ground is very much the same today as it was then, being divided into two. The Bees had a club but nowhere to play matches. The offer of a field in Windmill Lane was declined, although it transpired that a few years later the club did move there. It was decided to accept the offer of Edwin Underwood, who was to become the club president, and use his field behind the local board offices and the Wesleyan Chapel. The entrance to the ground was at the junction of Braemar and Brook Road South, and this gap in the houses is still present. Opposite is the Griffin pub, which became the headquarters and dressing rooms for the club. The landlord, Frederick Allen, was a keen supporter. The field, known as the Clifton House Ground, was close to the orchard off Braemar Road that in 1904 became Griffin Park. The pitch lay east to west, although somewhat small at only 80 yards long and 50 wide. 2 tiny structures, shown on the OS map of the period, were possibly a refreshment hut and a pay box. The first match was played here versus Kew on the 23rd of November 1889. And the last on 26th of March 1892 versus Hounslow. Around the First World War period, the site became Clifton Road with its houses, the Brentford Girls' School and part, much later, the club's car park on match day. Overall, Clifton House was not ideal, and after 2+ years a move was necessary due to the future sale of the site. There were many fields in the area, but they would have been difficult to enclose. Plus, the popularity of the club was such that it also attracted an unruly element, and hence a reluctance by owners to rent out. Up Windmill Road and into Little Ealing, the club moved about a mile away. At the junction of Northfields Avenue is the Plough pub. The current one was built in 1903 and Charles Benn was the owner, and he also ran the pub. Eventually, within an 11+ acres, a site was found, known as Ben's Field, off Northfields Avenue. then lane. The ground was large enough for 2 pitches, the reserve team often playing there at the same time as the first. The main pitch probably laying alongside the railway embankment close to the current Northwood station. This formed a boundary but allowed some unwanted free viewing. The Plough was used as a clubhouse and for dressing rooms, although it was a long walk to the football ground itself. Most of this area has now been built over, but one undeveloped remainder of the former ground is Bramley Road open space. Although the football ground was probably partly fenced in, it was not ideal, being over a mile from Brentford and a long walk to the Plough. In the 1890s, part of this large open area was known as the Bowling Greens and Pleasure Grounds, with an ornate arched entry adjacent to the pub. Gaps still exist between it and the next structure. The first match at Bensfield was on the 22nd of October 1892 versus Kensal, and the last on the 15th of December 2 years later. In the summer of 1894, Brentford amalgamated with the St Paul's Club, who played their matches at nearby Ealing Park on Little Ealing Lane, a short distance from the Plough. Whilst negotiations continued to secure a new ground, the first match of the 1894-95 season was played at Ealing Park, a friendly versus Parsons Green, on the 15th of September. No more games were played there as the pitch was not wide enough. Lieutenant Colonel Stracey Clitheroe owned much of the land around Windmill Road. He lived in Boston Lodge alongside the Ride and leased part of his land to Messrs Shotters and Vasey on the west side of the road. Brentford played one first-team match and some reserve games at what was then known as George Clark's Field in 1890 and 1891. It was described as one of the best in Middlesex, but initially it was not fully enclosed and lacked facilities. But Shotters Field, as it was known, was closer to Brentford. Hoardings were later erected on the east side, although free viewing was gained by climbing the trees along the Windmill Road boundary. During the summer of 1895, a reserved enclosure was incorporated. The first match at Shotters Field on the 22nd of December 1894 was versus the 8th Hussars. In 1895, the field was let to Mr. Beldam. No lover of football, he continued to sublet for the 1896-97 season, but at a higher rent. The Bees were attracting attendances of over 2,000, and a record 3,500 were at the game with Thames Ironworks, later West Ham United, on the 23rd of April 1898. 1 week later, the last match at Shotters Field was versus Barking Woodville. When even more rent was demanded for the forthcoming season, the club refused to pay. Although some distance away, the Duke of York pub in Brook Road North served as a clubhouse for Brentford F.C. Later named the New England, it closed in 2005, was demolished in 2016, and flats now stand on the site. The final, fourth Brentford ground in the area, followed in the summer of 1898. This was further along Little Ealing Lane at its junction with Pope's Lane, so named for a former cross erected on the northeast corner relating to the Pope. The site was a 5.5 acre field occupied by Brentford Celtic, who agreed to amalgamate with the Bees. There were no facilities at the Crossroads ground, as it became known, although a corrugated iron structure was erected for basic dressing rooms and refreshments. The pitch was narrow and sloped to one end. The first league game was versus St Albans on the 10th of September, before a poor crowd of only 500. Although around 4,000 watched the friendly on the 17th of April 1899 versus FA Cup winners Sheffield United. There were fewer than 200 versus Upton Park later. Now in the Southern League, Southall were the last visitors on the 21st of April 1899 before 800 spectators. In 1900, Brentford moved to the Boston Park Cricket Ground, a venue suggested by Mr Underwood to share, some years earlier, the rent settling the Christmas cricketers' debts. The sports ground lay adjacent to Ealing Road, just north of the railway and York Road, and close to the Duke of York, which continued as the clubhouse. The ground was fenced in, and on the north side just two small pavilions for changing rooms and members. On the 15th of September 1900, Chesham Generals were the first visitors for a friendly match, and the first Southern League opponents were Southall, the last visitors to the Crossroads, before around 2000. The cricket club were reluctant for the Bees to continue at their ground, the debts now having been written off, yet allowed the football club to proceed with plans to provide covered stands. Flower pot stands, as they became known, were built at the Ealing Road end with earth banks opposite, plus hot showers and baths in the pavilion. The stands were enlarged and the banking increased for Arsenal's FA Cup visit on the 13th of December 1902. On Boxing Day, visitors Fulham attracted an all-time record attendance of over 12,000. Brentford played their last match at the sports ground on 2nd of April 1904, when around 8,000 were present for the visit of Southampton. The cricket club and the ground itself remained until the 1930s. In the decades since, the site has seen various buildings and housing on the site, and there is now nothing left to identify the former ground. In 1904, Brentford moved around 100 metres to the other side of the railway line to a former orchard, and Griffin Park was created, with an initial 21-year lease at £40 per annum. The western boundary almost abutted the site of their first ground at Clifton House. The next 116 years at Griffin Park is another story. The final circle was completed when the club moved, less than 2 kilometres away, back to Kew Bridge, to the brand new stadium in Lionel Road, around 200 metres from where it all started in 1889 at the site of the former Oxford and Cambridge Hotel.